Hello, everybody. Pete Fader here. It is our fourth event in the Wharton School Press Meet the Authors series. I've been just so delighted to have a chance to talk to my colleagues. In January, it was Michael Platt talking about his book, The Leader's Brain. In March, it was Jonah Berger talking about The Catalyst. And in May, it was Katie Milkman talking about How to Change. But today, we turn things over to a good friend and colleague in our management department, Mauro Guillén. And Mauro is going to talk about, well, actually, he has two books to talk about. He has his book that came out last year, but was looking ahead 10 years, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. But again, that's literally behind him. We're going to want to spend most of our time talking about the platform paradox, how digital businesses succeed in an ever-changing global marketplace. Mauro is the Zanman Endowed Professor in International Management here at the Wharton School. He used to run our esteemed Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies, but he's not going to be with us much longer because on July 1st, Mauro becomes the Dean at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Mauro, it is great to see you. It is great to have you with us as long as we can hold on to you and some very exciting times ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Pete, for inviting me. I'm so delighted to be here with you. You're one of my favorite colleagues here, as you know, at the Wharton School, and I am thrilled to be able to talk about this book.
Yes, indeed. And I want to make sure that all of us can talk about the book. So I hope that all of you listening out there will enter questions however you can, and we'll make sure we spend lots of time getting them tomorrow as well. But I have a bunch of questions, Mauro. I want to first talk a little bit about the book. I want to talk a little bit about the book writing process. I want to talk about your own personal values and trajectory. So let's get in right away and talk about the platform paradox. We got two words over there. I think we need to talk about each one of them separately and then together. So platform, a term that really didn't mean much in business until relatively recently, but now everybody talks about it, sometimes in a way that might be a little bit inconsistent, unclear. So give us a specific definition of what we mean by a platform.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Pete. It's so much easier to essentially name examples of digital platforms, anything and everything from Google to Amazon, Facebook, you name them. And these are essentially, I think, the best way to define them is virtual places where either a single type of user or several different kinds of users can join and then do business or entertain themselves, or exchange something of value, or just simply, as we're doing right now, communicate with one another. Those are platforms, virtual meeting places where different kinds of users can essentially do something that is of interest to them. That's essentially what a platform is.
And before we get to the paradox part, why is it the case that platforms have really taken over our imagination, our lexicon, the world of business? What's changed recently to make them so ubiquitous and desirable?
Well, I mean, essentially they have grown like crazy. And as you know, pretty much everybody these days participates on a regular basis and on at least, 5 or 10 of these platforms. And it's just, they've become so easy to use. They become so valuable to us. And they have so much potential in terms of helping us become more efficient at what we do, in terms of helping us reach out to others, including companies, but not only companies, also peers, in ways that we couldn't imagine before. And as you said, I mean, they're everywhere. They're ubiquitous. It doesn't matter what you're doing at a given time during the day. You're very likely to be interacting or to be using one of these platforms.
Which takes us to the paradox that you say they're ubiquitous. Indeed, they are. And we could think in our own lives about how different kinds of platforms, including the ones you've mentioned and many others, dominate kind of everything we do and think about, yet very few of them dominate the world. Tell us
Yeah,
a little
that's
bit more
right.
about that.
That's right. That's the paradox part. So, as you said at the beginning, I'm a professor of international management. So, everything that I've done in my 30 plus years as a scholar is essentially do research and teach about how companies pursue opportunities around the world. And as you know, I mean, it is hard for a business to begin with to become a well known brand or to have a presence in multiple markets around the world. It's not easy. And sure, there are some brands that conquer the world, but most companies don't. The paradox, I think, is the following: we tend to see the internet, we tend to see the digital world as a world without frontiers, without borders, certainly no national borders. And yet, when you think about even some of the largest digital platforms we participate in as users, maybe they have a presence in 10 or 20 countries in the world, a strong presence. Maybe they have a 20% global market share. But it's very rare to see platforms with 70%, 80, 90% global market share. Hence the paradox. How come that these platforms are using a purely global medium, right? Which is the internet, which is the digital infrastructure that we have. But at the same time, so few of them actually become truly global in terms of their footprint. It's for me, it's a paradox. It's been a paradox for the last 10 years since I started studying these platforms. And it continues to be something that doesn't really quite fit.
So obviously you can't raise a paradox, although it really is intriguing by itself, just to take it at face value, like, that's right. It's more than just a series of coincidences. There's some good reasons why this is the case. So start digging in a little bit deeper.
Well, let's take perhaps the platform that everybody knows because it is controversial, but it's also because it was a true pioneer, Uber, right? So let's not forget, Pete, even the Collins English Dictionary now has an entry for the verb to Uber, okay, or to Uberize. And they also have an entry for the noun Uberization, okay? So this is a company that has changed everything, right? Has changed the way we think about transportation, has changed the way we think about gig work. It's a platform that has changed, I think, the way in which we think about regulation and about how far these platforms can go without getting into trouble with regulators. And yet, Uber really only has a presence in, let's say, a strong presence in about 500, 600 cities in the world. And let's not forget, there's 20,000 cities in the world with more than 100,000 people. So there's plenty of other locations in which Uber could be strong, but it isn't. And there are many of those cities in which Uber no longer has a presence. They tried to establish a presence, but they failed because there was a local competitor that managed to find a better way of delivering that kind of a service. So, with all of its clout, all of its fame, Uber is not all powerful. I think it is the best example of the paradox. Is that how come that this company that everybody knows, um, the company, the brand that has become part of the vernacular, and yet it doesn't have a global presence at all?
So start to give us those reasons. You mentioned local competition, but what is it about platforms per se, as opposed to just other business practices, just a more conventional reseller, that makes it harder to become globally dominant?
Yeah. So let's use a little bit of jargon here, okay? As academics, Pete, you and I like to use concepts, like to use, technical terms. And of course, there are some of those that still apply to this world of platforms, like economies of scale, uh, or like a first mover advantage and all of that. But the concept that is critical to understanding competition in these kinds of businesses is the network effect. And of course, it's a concept that is used by all sorts of in all sorts of areas of business, in marketing, of course, in operations, as well as in strategy, which is my field. And here's the thing: There are many different ways of thinking about network effects. There's many different ways in which you can classify network effects. But the one that is relevant for understanding the platform paradox is the geographical level at which the network effects play out. So let me just give you a very simple example. If you go to Uber or Lyft or your favorite platform, hoping to be able to get from your home to the train station, you, as the potential rider, you couldn't care less about how many Ubers there are in operation in Sydney, Australia. All you care about is how many Ubers are, let's say, within a couple of miles of where you are, so that you can get on time to the station. And from the point of view of the other participants in this platform, which is the drivers, also they couldn't care less about how many drivers there are in the streets of Sydney, Australia right now. All they care about is about the local network effect, right? So a platform for ride hailing like Uber depends on local network effects. And that's what makes it vulnerable to local competitors, right? It doesn't matter that you already operate in 10 cities. Another platform could go to an 11th city and establish itself there because the network effects are purely local, right? So having a presence in 10 cities doesn't give you necessarily an advantage in an 11th city or a 12th city. Whereas at the other extreme, if the network effects are truly global, for example, think about Skype, think about Google, right, as a search engine, then, the bigger you get anywhere in the world, the better chances you have of actually dominating other markets because the network effects are global. So that's the fundamental insight in the book.
Mm-hmm.
That is the starting point in the entire argument in the book.
That's great. Well, I just want to remind everybody, questions, please, questions, or your own observations about what platforms do you think most about, which ones do apply to, or might be exceptions to this paradoxical argument that Mauro's putting out there. So please, I'd love to make the conversation as broad as possible. We have this great platform to utilize, so we might as well take full advantage of it. So Mauro, it's one thing to lay out a paradox and to come up with some of these explanations, such as the global versus local network effects, but we also got to lay out some directions of how to move ahead, how to kind of fight against these forces and find success. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I remember vividly, Pete, that you oftentimes present yourself as an MIT trained person, right? You like modeling, you like using a lot of numbers and some Greek, I guess. And so I also started this project by trying to model these network effects and to see what would be the implications of that. And let me just offer you an illustration, right? So the goal of the book is really to give people who are running these platforms or people who want to launch their own platform, entrepreneurs, or also people who are venture capitalists and they want to invest in the latest platform. So I wanted to give them a way of understanding which platforms may be in a better position to grow fast and how they should arrange their operations, should they make decisions over time to grow as fast as possible, because that's, as you know, the name of the game with all of these platforms. In a world that once again is not of one piece, not because the internet is not global, but rather because the network effects may not be global, right? So a critical strategy question is, as an entrepreneur, as a new platform, you have limited resources and you have to allocate those resources in the best possible way. So let's examine, for example, the case of Airbnb, right? So yes, it became eventually the largest platform for accommodation sharing in the world. But how did it get there? So it started in the United States. So then the question is, what's next? You want to conquer the world, but do you expand randomly around the world? Or do you follow some kind of a sequence? So in order to figure out what is the best strategy, what I explain in the book is that you need to think about the network effects. So in the case of Airbnb, Pete, you need to then figure out who is moving where in order to enjoy a vacation. So tourism or business travel. So let's just think about the numbers. Most tourism is within a nation, right? Most Americans go to another American city or location on tourism, right? Next, after that in frequency comes regional tourism. So most Americans, if they go on a trip and that trip is not within the US, That means they're going to Canada, to Mexico, to the Caribbean. Okay? That's the next concentric circle. And then the next one is global tourism, right? So then next after that, Americans go to Europe, or they go to South America, or they go to Asia, and so on and so forth. So knowing that that is a reality of travel, right, that was confronting a platform such as Airbnb, then what they did was precisely to allocate resources, to start opening offices, to invest in their presence in such a way that they could reach critical mass of users as quickly as possible, but following some kind of a sequence. In other words, it would make sense for them to first go to Japan, right? Mm-hmm. The way to build up the network effects would be to move in concentric circles from the US, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, what makes it tricky for a platform such as Airbnb is that, like with Uber, you have two types of users. You have the tourists, but you also have the people who are offering their space up for rent, right? So you need to play to both, because there is also such a thing, and I get into this into the book very in much detail. There's such a thing as a cross-side network effects. It's not just that people who use Airbnb attract more users, or that people who host on Airbnb attract more hosts. It's also that more hosts attract more users, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So at some point, as you know, given that you have a mathematical mind, Pete, at some point it gets complicated, because you need to take into account all of these different kinds of same-side, cross-side, network effects at different geographical levels. So that's what I try to explain in the book in an intuitive way. The book has no math, but I try to show with examples how successful companies build their presence around the world, right, in the fastest possible way, so that they can reach critical mass of users before any other platform does. Once again, depending on the geographical level at which the network effects operate. Mm-hmm. That's in a nutshell how the book is useful.
Very interesting. Well, let's want to work backwards a little bit, maybe touching on the journey that led you to the book. Maybe a brief comment about the 2030 book that you wrote last year, and just your other activities at Wharton, because I think the book is great, as is any book by one of our colleagues at Wharton. But very often the process is a mystery. So tell us a bit about the path that led to it.
Well, this particular book, the idea for it came from my teaching at Wharton. So if you remember, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we changed the MBA curriculum. And at the same time, then many of us changed what we were teaching undergraduate, because we teach, classes at both levels, as you know. And one of the things that I thought was really important, in addition to just changing the curriculum I was teaching in the core, was to incorporate all of these new kinds of businesses that were propping up, right? Especially platform businesses. And so I decided to actually do something very radical, which is I got rid of all of the cases of companies that I was teaching prior to that curricular reform. And I decided to include only platform businesses on my syllabus, believe it or not, although I was teaching the core, right? And it was challenging, Pete. It was challenging precisely for the reason that I decided to write the book, which is that not all of the concepts that we have inherited from the past were useful in terms of understanding how these businesses should grow internationally. But not only that, some of the key concepts were missing from our regular textbooks or our usual theories, right? And so I had in real time, as I was preparing for each class, to come up with a new way of thinking about it, mostly in terms of network effects, because that is the critical, as I've been saying, concept here, right? So that's how this came into being. Now, my other book, 2030, helped, because as part of that book, I examined technological trends into the future. And it made me realize that, as you said at the beginning, the global economy is being literally taken over by these platforms. Even established companies, let's say Walmart, now has to play the platform game. And they're either creating their own platforms to reach consumers, or they are participating in marketplaces, such as, for example, JD.com in China, right? So every company, whether it's new or it's established, has to incorporate platforms into their strategies. So that's why I decided to write the book. And I felt that it was very important to engage in conceptual development, right? sometimes of a mathematical kind, sometimes more qualitative. And that's what the background to the book, essentially. I saw that there was a big opportunity for essentially developing new conceptual tools to help us understand how these platforms work.
That's great. And it's so nice to hear that it really was the teaching that led to it, because all too often the books that we write just reflect the research that we've done, which then drives the teaching. But in this case, the teaching drove the writing, and it's good to see that sometimes teaching is kind of a cause rather than effect of some of the scholarly work that we do. So the questions are coming in. If you don't mind, I'm going to dive right in over here. Our first one is from Adele on LinkedIn. Do you think that the platform or digital broker business is sustainable given its strong commission-based revenues, taking a bigger chunk out of the value?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think Adele is referring to a classic distinction between platforms that are mere brokers and platforms that are providers. So they provide some content or even some physical good, right? And the purest example of a broker, just so we're all on the same page, I think would be a digital dating platform, right? So a digital dating platform, all it does is just help people connect to one another. The content is created by the users, if you know what I mean, right? And so a provider is a completely different ballgame. So LinkedIn, what is LinkedIn? Well, I actually think that LinkedIn is a hybrid. So it clearly started as a broker. So we had people like you and I, Pete. We have professional interests, and we go to that platform to try to, get to know other people within our profession. But you also have employers, right? And that's where, we start to see that maybe there's some provision of goods or services. But even more importantly, now people like yourself or myself, we're posting video, we're posting content on LinkedIn. We're not charging for people to see that content, but we are going well beyond just that. And a lot of people can enjoy that content, right? And so I think LinkedIn is or has, like many purely broker platforms, gravitated slowly over time towards becoming more of a provider of other things. So in that sense, Adele, the person who asked the question, may be correct in saying that the business model of the pure broker, except for perhaps the case of digital dating, is unstable. In other words, that you're open to so much competition. It's very difficult to hold the line, right, in terms of keeping your users your own, that then most of these platforms eventually evolve into providing something. So I think it's a very interesting question. And it is, I think, strategically a very important one for these platforms if they want to survive.
Yeah, and it leads to the next question from Pratik coming through LinkedIn. This idea of holding the line, this idea of what kinds of tricks or strategies do the kind of online giants rely on to weed out and fend off some of the up and coming new businesses and new platforms?
Well, I think Pratik is referring to both dirty tricks and just a plainly fair game. In terms of in terms of the latter, so things that are fair for these platforms to do is just to exploit the network effects. But once again, you have to be very careful as to whether they operate at the local, the national, the regional, or the global level, right? Well, if you understand the network effects better than other platforms, if you allocate resources in such a way that then you can benefit from those network effects, then you will reach critical mass. Then you will come to dominate the market earlier. You may have a problem then with the competition authorities, with antitrust, but that's another matter, right? And then the other thing is the dirty tricks, right? So we all know that many platforms, and I don't want to give any names, of course, engage in uncompetitive behavior. And they do set up things in such a way that is very difficult for newcomers, for new ventures to actually succeed. So that's also part of the reality. It was part of the reality of business before the digital age, of course. But I think it is particularly problematic in this age because at the end of the day, I would say we definitely want consumers to enjoy the benefits, not just the platforms by virtue of getting big and enjoying monopolistic power.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, a great question from Katie on Instagram here. Kind of expanding the scope of the conversation. You spoke a little bit about the genesis of this book idea and how it related to the previous book and your teaching, but let's take a couple of steps further back. So, when did you first discover and maybe even fall in love with these ideas, these trends that you observe with digital entrepreneurial success? The broader set of issues that led to the book.
So there are two things I would mention, and thank you, Katie, for that question. First of all, so I'm from Spain. That's where my accent comes from. I came here to the United States to get my PhD, and then the rest is history. Like so many other people, I decided to stay because of the huge opportunities over here. And I've always been fascinated by the diversity of the world, and more specifically, how much trouble companies typically have attempting to operate, attempting to be successful across different parts of the world. Because it's just complicated, right? I mean, the culture interferes, government regulation, exchange rates, all sorts of things. So that's where I'm coming from here for this book. As I've been explaining, I've been trying to understand how these digital platforms expand around the world. And again, contrary to the conventional wisdom that because the internet is a global medium, then these companies can just be simply global. What I found time and again was that they also face enormous difficulty expanding around the world. And then the other biographical aspect that I think is worth mentioning, Pete, in this context is that I've always been a champion in our own industry, in education, of everything that has to do with platforms. So for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been increasingly engaged in all sorts of initiatives that have to do with digital education, because I think it is a good idea to make education as widely accessible as possible. So that's another thing that has had an impact on me in terms of writing this book, in the sense that in writing this book, although I discuss many different kinds of platforms across many different kinds of industries, I also wanted to get or to gain a better understanding of how digital platforms can help overcome the problems, the bottlenecks that we have in the world in terms of helping people educate themselves.
And let's just take our last minute or two to talk about your next platform, stepping away from the Wharton School to become the new dean at the Judge School over at the University of Cambridge. Few thoughts about that transition, your objectives over there, your best memories of
Well,
Wharton?
my biggest message, Pete, is that the competition will be coming from the other side of the Atlantic now. But more importantly, look, it is personally a very interesting transition, in part because I'm European. So in spite of Brexit, I think this is going back to the other side of the Atlantic. But also, it's going to be, I think, interesting for me to see how I can make a contribution to a school that, unlike Wharton, which was founded, if you remember, in 1881, is only 35 years old. So it is the kind of institution right now. The university is very old and its brand is very well established, but the business school, the Judge Business School, is not as much. And so it is a great opportunity. I have an entrepreneurial mindset myself. I consider myself an academic entrepreneur. And so for me, this is a golden opportunity to experiment with new things, to work with my team over there, and to launch new educational initiatives that I'm hoping will make the world a better world. And by the way, people are saying that business school is becoming less relevant as time goes by, that the MBA degree is outdated. I actually think just the opposite. Whenever you go through such a massive transformation as we're going through now, especially because of changes in technology, I think we need more managers, not fewer of them. We need more because that process needs to be managed. It's as simple as that. So I'm very, very thrilled about this opportunity. And again, I mean, I see that the future of business education is bright, but we need to change. Business schools need to change. We need to incorporate technology. We need to better understand the customer, which, as you know, Pete, is fundamental. And above everything else, I think we need to find new ways of learning and of conveying knowledge.
Oh, that's great. Mauro, it's going to be so exciting for you and for your colleagues and students over there at the Judge School. Tremendous loss for all of us at the Wharton School. I want to personally thank you for everything that you've contributed to the school, all the great conversations that we've had. I've learned so much from you. I agree with you that the business school, the future of the business school is as bright as ever because of thoughtful people like yourself who are kind of changing the mold all the time, teaching new concepts. You just can't pick up some of these ideas anyplace else. But if you do want to pick up these ideas, whether it's 2030 or the platform paradox, they're both available from the Wharton School Press bookstore. In fact, I think we're even offering a 40% discount on the newest book. So I hope that people will take advantage of that. I encourage everyone out there to check out what's going on at the Wharton School in general. Follow us on social media, and Wharton School Press that has made these sessions possible for us these last few months. It's been a real pleasure to participate in them, and I can't think about a better way to close at least the spring summer 2021 series than with you, Mauro. So thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Pete. And I should return the compliments here. I've learned so much from you and from your books published with the Wharton Press, which I use, by the way, in my classes, especially the concept of a lifetime value of the customer, which I think is an eye-opening concept. And thank you, of course, to everyone at the Wharton School Press for all of the support. And, let's obviously continue working together virtually.
We look forward to it. Thanks very much, Mauro. Take care, everyone.